Hello, it's Jack Tutor here of Attention Magazine. Welcome to Crucial Listening, the podcast where I speak with musicians and sound artists about 3 albums that are important to them. My guest this time is JJ Anselmi, drummer of sludgy metalcore band Drainage, and most pertinent to this conversation, author of Doomed to Fail, the incredibly loud history of doom, sludge and post-metal. It's a really good book. I've been reading it over the past couple of weeks. JJ writes so evocatively with such passion. This is clearly music that has defined the trajectory of his life. And it's one of those music books that makes you want to check out all the bands that you already love again. So for me, that's like Neurosis, Godflesh, Author and Punisher, Big Brave. But also all the bands that you hadn't heard before or were keen to check out but never got round to. JJ writes with such passion and persuasion about why these bands are great or why they're interesting to listen to. So the likes of Candlemass, The Obsessed, I've been diving back into Black Sabbath as we discuss in this conversation. It's a really fantastic book, and it's definitely reconnected me with the idea of heavy music as a really fundamental thing in my life, but also as a type of music that really illustrates how enjoyment is not the correct word for why this music is so compelling. There's, as JJ says, there's something about authenticity here. It speaks to different aspects of the human experience. And sometimes these aspects of the experience are only really accessible through heavy music. And he captures that so well in this book. It's a really good read. I would thoroughly recommend you check it out. Go over to jjanselmi.com, where you can find more information on Doomed to Fail. And as always, go to attentionmagazine.co.uk/crucial listening for more information on JJ's picks and links to his work as well. Cool. So this was a really cool conversation, and I hope you enjoy it as well. So without any further delay, JJ Anselmi on Crucial Listening. Hello JJ, welcome to Crucial Listening.
Hey Jack, thanks so much for having me on.
So before we start talking about your 3 important records that you've brought to the table, I want to ask you about your book, Doomed to Fail, History of Doom, Sludge and Post-Metal, which I devoured in audio form over the past couple of weeks. The book is, to say for people who are intrigued, it's split into 3 sections. So you've got Doom, Sludge and Post-Metal. Reading through the book, I think you make a really strong case for treating these in their own trajectory, but you really get the sense as you're reading it that there's a strong kinship between these styles of music. I mean, my first question is, at what point did it become clear to you that this was how you wanted to structure this book?
I think that was actually the toughest question or kind of toughest problem that I faced throughout. Once I realized that I wanted to write a book on heavy music. And to me, like you said there, doom, sludge, and post-metal have always been kind of distinct to me, especially as I got older. But I've also always seen them as, like intrinsically connected. At the very base, it's very slow, heavy metal. I think is kind of like the broadest way you can describe it all. But yeah, trying to lump it all into one book was kind of a big challenge. I was reading books like Choosing Death by Albert Mudrian, the book on death metal, and then American Hardcore. And both of those books and a lot of other music books follow a really kind of linear trajectory. But when I thought of lumping, like Neurosis into the same discussions of I hate God or going backwards into Doom, it just didn't quite feel right. So I realized that once I realized I should separate them into their own kind of classifications, and the book should be separated that way. And then each one follows more of a linear trajectory within the subgenre. It made a lot more sense to me. But then I started facing the question of like, well, is this band really doom, or where do they go in this? Like, do they go in the sludge section? And so sometimes it was pretty straightforward, but then there were a lot of questions, like with Corrupted, the Japanese band. I remember it was a really hard one because I was like, well, is it doom or is it sludge? And then part of me was just like, is this like just a bullshit stupid question to even think about? Does it even matter? Because there is at some point where it's just like, is the music good or is it, not good,
right,
in essence? But then as it Corrupted, they've always had like a very kind of specific ideology about not really doing interviews and not having people photograph them. And so something like that really struck me as coming from more of like a kind of a punk background, where a lot of bands have a very defined ideology that they try to stick to in addition to the music. So yeah, once I figured out the structure, there was some tough questions like that. But yeah.
I mean, one thing that I noticed, which I think maybe, I don't know whether it was deliberately done to make your job easier in that respect, but what I love about the way you've written the book is that the music leads first. So you've got chapters on bands. You don't have chapters on a specific stage of the lineage of doom. So you're not setting out a ideology and then plugging bands kind of into that hole. You're just kind of letting the development of that music be a byproduct of just talking about these bands. I mean, I love that because it just means that you end up talking so much about the music and those bands specifically, rather than a sort of peripheral theorizing around those bands. Was that an intentional move?
Yeah, definitely. I really tried to look as closely as possible about where the bands were coming from. And the more I thought about it, that kind of made sense of the need for the classifications of doom, sludge, and post-metal, because when I started kind of looking at the earliest practitioners of doom, like Black Sabbath and Coven, and then kind of onward, I felt like I kind of realized there was always like a reaching toward some kind of like larger spiritual understanding or truth. But then when it came to like when Melvins and I Hate God came into the mix, it was very much more grounded in just like daily life. A lot of kind of like concrete negativity, which there's, all kinds of that stuff in doom as well. But I feel like a lot of those bands, like modern day versions being like Yob and Bell Witch, who close out the doom chapter, I still feel like there's some kind of reaching toward, whatever you want to call it, spiritual understanding, or just maybe even some kind of, connection with the spiritual self. So yeah, I feel like those kind of classifications were really a way to honor where the musicians were coming from. And like you said, kind of put the music first, because as much as it can kind of sound silly of like distinguishing between doom and sludge, when like Melvins came along, it was a lot different. The where they were coming from, the music, they were coming from a hardcore background and had gotten sick of that. So yeah, it's just all kind of a way of trying to honor where the people were actually coming from when they created the music that they did.
And when you're talking about this music, I mean, your writing style is so evocative. I think that's why I've gone to listen to so many of these bands after reading about them, because the enthusiasm that you imbue into talking about this music is so infectious. But you also write about them in the way which kind of gives the impression that you are already incredibly well versed in this music. I mean, I know from writing these kind of books that it involves devouring such a huge amount of music. Was there anything that came out of this writing and producing this book for you where, I don't know, certain bands or records that you'd not really considered before suddenly kind of leapt to the forefront and made you think, oh wow, this is actually really cool?
Yeah, the more I should go back and say thank you for the really kind comment, or really kind compliment. That's really awesome. Sure. And I should say too, that's exactly kind of what I was going for, is that I've always had this huge, kind of this huge enthusiasm for the music. And so really my goal with the book was to just bring people into that, to say like, here's why it's meant so much to me over the years. And if you already know about it, then go back and listen to all this stuff that you already love. Or if you don't know about it, like come on in, it's also for you. But one of my favorite things about this book has been like really putting all these records in context as much as I possibly could. So really trying to go back and see like what Candlemass was listening to, for example, when they made, Epicus, Doomicus Metallicus. I always feel silly saying that record, saying that album name, and really trying to understand like as closely as possible, trying to understand what those records sounded like when they came out, because I think that's really when a lot of that stuff is really, really special, when you try to put it alongside other music of the time, and then you can start to realize how impactful it really was. And as far as bands that I started to appreciate on a new level, Cathedral was a really huge one. When I started to go back and realize how slow they were playing for the time, and using the really gnarly growling vocals, and then putting that alongside other heavy music that was coming out, I just realized, I was just like, oh shit, this was fucking insane for the time. This was really, really gnarly. There was some of the other Death Doom stuff, I had similar reactions. The band Winter was one of the big ones. And I just, when you kind of think about it in the context of the really early 90s, of these bands playing so slow and so just torturously, it's pretty mind-blowing, considering that like it really took, almost like 20, 30 years for other people to start to catch up and make music that's that heavy, like in, Bell Witch and stuff like that.
Yeah. It makes total sense that someone like Southern Lord would reissue that Winter record, right? To kind of put it in the current context. Yeah,
for sure. And it is kind of, there's always, some difficulty, because, as far as like, that's a good example of a band that I was just, I was like 5 or 6 years old when Winter was making the records. And so I really wasn't old enough for a long time to understand what was happening. And so I'm really looking at all of it in retrospect and trying to piece it together, which is, I don't know, maybe one of the benefits of the book, or kind of, I don't know. I guess it definitely wouldn't have been possible without the internet to write this book the way it came out.
One other question I wanted to ask was about your band Drainage. So you're a drummer. I should also say that comes through in the book in the best way. Like as soon as you start talking about drummers, I feel all of that life of drumming coming forward in the prose, which is absolutely lovely. But I've been listening to Drainage's latest EP that you released last year, The Younger, Older You, and it's really good. Been having the best time. I think what I love is music that is played very slow and with such weight, and yet is so concise. It's fabulous. Sound is unbelievable. I wanted to ask, what are your memories of recording that one? Because the sound, like the quality of the production is immense.
Yeah, the production is all in thanks to our friend Rolly, who's just this amazing producer, and he also plays in this just phenomenal death metal band called Teeth. It's like this dissonant death metal, and they just create these layers that to me it reminds me of seeing like Neurosis or something like that, where just the music completely surrounds you, which is to kind of like, to me that type of layering, to hear it in death metal is just kind of something else. Is pretty rare. And so Rolly, I mean, the production is just because Rolly is such a good producer. We did it in one day, and in addition to being a phenomenal guitarist, he's also he can play drums and just knows how to get everything to sound very, very good. So we recorded that. They actually, before I had joined the band, had those songs written, and I've only been in the band for about a year and a half, and Drainage really started as the guitarist Ricky is kind of his like solo project, and he's doing this really gnarly industrial, and then he formed a full band with Dee and the original drummer Shane, and they made the first record. And then when I moved out here to Long Beach, I was playing with a different band for a little while. Once I discovered Drainage, I could just feel, I was like, I should be in that band. I knew that we had like a similar affinity for all of the Hydra Head, kind of like sludge metalcore stuff. It really came across very clearly in the sound, because in addition to like, heavy stuff like Floor, we all really love Coalesce and, kind of that early like mid 90s metalcore. The actual recording of the album was just a very like kind of loose, fun day. It really creates a very like welcoming atmosphere. And Drainage, one of the things that I really love about the band is that we're just really great friends and love hanging out with each other, as kind of cheesy as that sounds. And so when we get together and play, it's usually, it's like music is obviously a huge part of it, but we're also just hanging out and kind of shooting the shit and joking around and just enjoying being around each other. So that's kind of, like anxiety inducing as the music is supposed to be, the actual creating of it is very positive and warm and friendly.
Yeah, often the way, I think.
Yeah.
So let's talk about your 3 important records, JJ. I wanted to ask how you thought about the term important when picking your list of records. I mean, there's so many different ways to slice that term. So how did you think about the term important when picking your list of 3 albums?
Yeah, that's one thing that I was tempted to ask you, like, what you mean by important, but then I realized, I was like, oh, that's part of the fun of it, is I'm kind of supposed to decide. And the way I decided was very similar to kind of my decision-making process for which albums and bands to focus on in the book, was just really trying to look at impact. And it was really hard to limit it to 3, but I tried to focus on 3 records that, if you took them away, there would just be this huge wave of bands and sounds that wouldn't really exist in the same way. The most obvious one was Black Sabbath, self-titled record. And I've always, one of the things that, really made me a huge Black Sabbath fan in high school was that I realized just how intense it was for the context. When you kind of go back and listen to other stuff that came out in 1970, it's just in completely its own world, and it still kind of blows my mind. I do wish, if I could ever time travel, to just go back in time and really get a feel for how that record sounded to people when it came out, because it's still so heavy today, and I can't really imagine what it sounded like back then. And so the first choice was pretty easy, and then the next 2 are a little bit more difficult. I chose Melvins Gluey Porch Treatments because to me it really was like the kind of first push of like actual sludge metal and channeling like an impish punk and hardcore spirit into music. It's very grounded in reality. It's also like super dirty and sounds almost kind of nonsensical at times. And yeah, that was like the record that pushed I Hate God and essentially like all these sludge bands to exist in the first place. And so that was another one that was huge with the impact. And then the Neurosis record, Through Silver and Blood, I thought hard if I should include, it was between that record or Godflesh self-titled album.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, because it was a really hard decision, because I don't think that Neurosis record would sound like it does without the Godflesh record, which is kind of a, so maybe I should have picked, no, I don't know. I could say, I stand behind the Neurosis, because I think they still took a lot of that stuff, like what Justin Broadrek had been doing in Godflesh, and the idea behind it of like exploring heavy metal, but kind of deconstructing it in a lot of ways and just trying to reimagine it into something else. I feel like Through Silver and Blood really took that to this logical conclusion that to this day is just very gnarly and intense. And it's one of the few records in my life that have genuinely like scared me the first time I listened to them. And the other two were I Hate God, Take As Needed for Pain. Like the first times I really started getting into it, there was just this very real menace there that scared me but also like drew me in. And then Sun, Black One, scared the shit out of me the first time I listened to it.
Oh my god, yeah, same.
And I think the Neurosis record, Through Silver and Blood, it recreates its members like subconscious weird darkness so well, and it draws you into it that it's just something that it's incredibly captivating, and it's a masterpiece on so many levels. And that really spawned the kind of popular conception of post-metal with like ISIS, and then moving on from there of like Rosetta and the Ocean and Cult of Luna and all those bands.
So which one of these records do you want to dive into first?
We could just go in order if you want to.
Sure thing. So Sabbath to begin with?
Sure.
Wicked. So you talk about this in the book, I think, Discovering Sabbath, and the impact they had on you at quite a young age. I think in the book you talk about playing Sabbath covers at the age of 12. But can you remember hearing this album for the first time?
Yeah, so when me and my friends were just kids, we kind of knew just Iron Man and Paranoid. And I knew, like, I thought of it as kind of just like cool, I don't know, exciting heavy metal. But it really wasn't until later, a couple of years later, when I was like 14 or 15 or maybe even 16, when I listened to the self-titled record and really started to understand how heavy Sabbath truly is. And especially going back to that time frame thing, when you put it next to other records like the first Led Zeppelin record, or any of the stuff that was like dark and scary back in 1970, and the sound is just so much more immense. It really is kind of mind-blowing. And
you used to play Sabbath covers. I mean, was there any songs off this record that you used to cover when you were a teenager?
No, I wish I would have. When my friends and I were like 12, the Iron Man and Paranoid was, a lot of it was just because the guitarist's older brother was really into Black Sabbath and we thought he was really cool. But then after that kind of period, we all discovered Korn, and that was, really where I focused a lot of my energy for a long time. Sure. But then once I started getting into Sabbath and Doom in general, I'm from a small town in Wyoming, and so I really would have wanted to play stuff like that. But by the time I was like 15, 16, I didn't really know anybody else in my hometown who liked doom metal. And then kind of later, when I got to know some of the older metalheads who I didn't go to school with, they still liked a lot of mostly like a lot of fast stuff and death metal and grindcore, which is awesome too, and they exposed me to a lot of that. But I was kind of on my own as far as like delving fully into the doom and sludge thing, although people did show me Crowbar back in the day, and so that was pretty life-changing as well.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
So with this Sabbath record, I mean, if you think back to memories listening to this album, what does that look like? Is there a particular place that you go back to, or a particular situation? Yeah,
for sure. What I'll always think about with this album is being 16 years old with my first car. It was kind of a junker, I guess. It was my grandma's old car, and it had been in a wreck, which is kind of a funny story in itself. My friend at the time was driving a rental car behind my mom, and Salt Lake City, Utah, and ended up running into the back of my grandma's car. And so that was my first car when I was 16, and it was this New Yorker with this huge dent in the back of it that had been hit and bashed in bumper, and it was one of those it had like a automated voice when that was like kind of a high-tech thing for a 1986 New Yorker to have, and so it's constantly saying that your washer fluid is low and shit like that. It was just like this walking Hessian mobile basically. And so when I got it, my friends and I, we were BMX kids, and so we had been watching these. There was this clothing brand called Little Devil, and we all, it was like a very gnarly, like progressive BMX brand as far as like the way those guys rode and stuff like that. And so there's also a lot of destruction attached to that culture, and we definitely thought it was all kind of cool and emulated those people by like spray painting these weird like hypnotism spirals on the car's wheels and just like whatever random shit on top of it, and then covering it in stickers, so it just looked like this kind of abomination as I was driving through my hometown in Wyoming. And so of course it had a tape player that didn't work and no CD player, and so I ended up just setting up a boombox in the back seat with a tape player because the tapes wouldn't skip. And so my memories of really listening to that first Sabbath record are of driving around in that car and playing especially like the first track, and really just understanding kind of the worldview that's behind it. With Black Sabbath coming from an industrial town, Birmingham, that to them really seemed like a dead end when they were younger, and that really resonated with me because the small town where I'm from is a coal mining boom town, and it just goes through like there'll be these intense energy booms where everybody's making money, and people from all over the country will move there to like get jobs and move away, and there ends up being housing shortages. But when I was growing up, it was during a bus phase when the work is a lot more sparse and people are kind of constantly worried about money, and just from a very early age it didn't seem like there was much hope in that place for me. And so listening to that Sabbath record really felt like the kind of a friend patting me on the shoulder, that it was just like this recognition of growing up somewhere like that I'll never really forget it. And it's hard to think of an album not only like as impactful on the culture of heavy metal, but as personally impactful as well, because I think you can really judge the albums that have a huge impact on you when you can remember the first time you listened to them, and you can remember where you were, and that's definitely one of them.
And is it a record that still comes out now?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, definitely. I might put it away for a little while, but yeah, it'll always be something I listen to. Especially what I really go back to now is Bill Ward's drumming on that album was just really mind blowing, and I think kind of underappreciated as far as like what he's actually doing. It's super energetic, and there's all kinds of like very high energy fills. You can really tell on that record that he came from a jazz background. It's almost like Buddy Rich, kind of playing really heavy music. There's a lot of like real deftness there that when I've heard anybody try to cover those songs, nobody plays them like Bill Ward did back in the day. And not even Bill Ward, like when I ended up seeing Black Sabbath later on, he didn't really have those the same chops anymore either.
So there's so many, it sounds like, anyway, from reading the book as well, there's a number of Sabbath records that have clearly resonate with you in quite an intense way. This one coming out being the first, I'm sure that grants it a certain amount of impact, like to come out with this and to this be your like opening statement proper is quite strong. But is there a particular reason why you went for this album over others? Is there any particular qualities of this record musically which meant that you wanted to bring this one to the table?
Yeah, I think a lot of it is the cultural context thing, that it was the first one, and there was just no real framework for music that's that heavy and so slow. Really, that's what I end up going back to, is just from the very first song on, it's very clear that it's something that was very different for the times. And I think still, when you put that record next to all the other Sabbath records, I could probably make an argument that the self-titled song is probably the heaviest song they ever wrote. I don't know, maybe not. No, I think I would make that argument.
Yeah. Well, yeah, because I'll be honest. So Sabbath has been a really interesting one in my life. Like I have friends who are absolutely obsessed with Sabbath, and at least once a year, I have someone preaching their love of Sabbath to me and saying, this band completely changed my life. I've never been able to establish that same connection with Sabbath myself. It was so fascinating to go in and listen to this record. Like I've not listened to the self-titled record all the way through.
Yeah.
So the first track I was expecting, I know the first track. The rest of it is, there's a real buoyancy to a lot of it, which I really wasn't expecting, and I don't really associate with Sabbath. Is the stuff that, as you say, Bill Ward's like a busy drummer. He's incredibly just technically wicked. But the music as well has a real energy to it. Does the stuff that's not so slow also speak to you in the same way as like the first track?
Yeah, for sure. And there's that kind of, maybe it's like a contradiction of playing music that comes from an angry and depressive place, but then there's also celebration in there. Or maybe that's just the fact of making music as humans, and we're kind of filled with all these weird contradictory emotions. But yeah, I think you're fully right. That record is the most clear that you can hear Sabbath in their early days of like when they were working as like a bar band that would get hired for I'm trying to remember, it's like 3 or 4 sets a night, I think.
What
would be a standard for like a lot of like blues bands and stuff like that back in the day. And it was, instead of like how we have like 4 or 5 bands at a show now, they would just hire one band that would play multiple sets. And so yeah, I think on that record you can really hear that background for Sabbath, and really hear them kind of like jamming around and entertaining themselves to a certain extent. And it's probably in the days when they weren't fully sick of each other yet, and so I think there's a lot of celebration there, and that comes across a lot in I think Master of Reality in Volume 4. That came back a lot, especially in like Sweet Leaf is a very celebratory song, or Lord of This World. All those riffs sound, there's like this element of fun to it, which is kind of, it's like I said, it seems kind of contradictory given like the idea that doom is supposed to be just very slow and depressive, but maybe it's just the human element of there's always joy even when you're depressed. It's not just, well, I shouldn't say that. For me, when I have been depressed, there's always like there's always kind of like rays of sunshine in there and stuff. It's not just straight sadness,
right?
And so just that human quality.
Yeah, I think we do, especially nowadays, have an association with bands that are incredibly severe, that they have to be locked into that end of the palette. Like there's no way that they can bring a bit of radiance to what they're doing, because it would almost feel to undermine it. But clearly it's something that can be done and can cohere perfectly well. Yeah, and I should say that's one reason I love like the band Torch comes to mind as a band who does that so well right now, and it's just very, very fun and positive. And I think it's very refreshing when a lot of there's that kind of sense that, like you said, metal has to be like dead serious and completely dark all the time. And I think it definitely can be, but it can also embrace every other aspect of being human.
What is this?
So let's go to your second record now, JJ. If you give me the name of it again, and then a little bit about how you first heard it. Let's go with that.
Yeah, Melvins, Gluey Porch Treatments. So that was kind of one of the bands that I remember my friend, when I was like 18 or 19, showed me Melvins, and he had found out about him because he's a huge Nirvana fan, and then kind of took a step back and discovered Melvins. And so I had heard it for a long time, but it was one of those bands that it took kind of quite a while for me to like fully understand exactly what it was. And Gluey Porch Treatments actually wasn't the record that did that. It was Stoner Witch really like brought me into the Melvins world and helped me kind of understand at least like that record, or understand the sound a little bit more. But then when I started going backwards, and again kind of I'm always trying to put music in context and imagine what it sounds like at the time it came out. Gluey Porch Treatments really just started to seem more and more mind-blowing to me. And it's another one of those albums that I think if you try to take it away, the amount of stuff that it influences, like is staggering. And so I always try to imagine, like, when I'm trying to judge impact, like if you took this album and it never had existed, like what else wouldn't exist? And I think there's so much that wouldn't really exist in the same way. And then for that one, doing an interview with Buzz Osborne really made me appreciate it on an entirely different level. And that was kind of one that I came away from the book just being even more appreciative of. And when I interviewed Buzz Osborne, I asked him a lot about just growing up in a small town and kind of what that was like. And it sounded like we had kind of a similar experience in that, he knew it sounded like from a pretty early age that that's not what he wanted his life to be. And that kind of, rural lifestyle of, like working very intense jobs and living in a place where everybody knows everybody, and the kind of cultural elements not being as pronounced just wasn't going to work for him. And so when I started to hear more and more about his background, and kind of I could feel a lot of that stuff come up in Gluey Porch Treatments for sure. But yeah, it's kind of going back. It's definitely a record that took me a little bit longer to like truly understand and appreciate.
When you say you could hear a lot of that stuff coming into Gluey Porch Treatments, tell me a bit more about that. Where are you hearing that in Gluey Porch Treatments? I
think part of it is just in its antagonistic spirit. He kind of it sounded like, I don't want to put words in his mouth necessarily, but it sounded like he had a pretty big chip on his shoulder growing up. He didn't like a lot of the people that he grew up with, and so if he was going to make music, it was going to kind of like press people's buttons. That seemed to be his response to that environment, is to maybe fuck with people a little bit. And so that album is like, when you think about it, is coming from kids who had grown up on hardcore and then became burnt out on that stuff. And so to kind of antagonize hardcore kids, they said, like, what would be the most annoying thing we could possibly do? And it would be, to play as slow as possible when everybody is trying to play faster and faster. They just jammed a kind of, a stick in the spokes and said, fuck you, we're actually going to do it way slower. And if it seems like the attitude was, if people hated it, all the better. Although that said, he did talk about kind of going on the first tour for that album and being very discouraged, because I think there was like, they had made this very antagonistic record, but then seeing people actually react to it with volatility and just straight up hating them, what seemed a little bit different and pretty discouraging for him.
Yeah, I think you make a really good point in the book where you say that it's so easy to romanticize that kind of antagonistic energy, but if you are facing that reaction and it's genuine vitriol for the thing that you've created, then actually that's quite intense for someone playing music.
Yeah, and it is. I think it's easy to have a sense of humor, but yeah, I've been in bands where we thought it was like funny to clear the room, but then after a while of just clearing the room, it's like, oh fuck, it's not a great feeling.
Yeah. I mean, one thing you talk about with this record a lot is Dale Crover's drumming. And again, this is what I really enjoy about the book, is that I'm never listening to music as default from the perspective of being a drummer, because I'm not. So when you get someone who's able to bring that perspective, I mean, it draws out a completely different appreciation of that music. And listening to this record from the perspective of kind of just listening to what Dale's doing is such a treat, because he's going all over the shop. Can you tell me, I mean, you talk about it so well in the book, can you tell me a bit about what it is about Dale's drumming, particularly on this record, that you really enjoy?
Sure, yeah. He's a classic example of what I call a behind the beat player, and it doesn't mean like playing off beat necessarily, but it's like it's such a small fraction amount of time where it's just a tiny bit, it's still on beat, but it's like the smallest bit kind of behind the guitar and bass, and so it really feels like it's like this huge foundation. It ends up creating this much bigger sound.
Yeah.
And he's I think he's one of the best people to ever kind of play in that style, and it just really creates this pedestal for everything to sound so much heavier and bigger. It creates this sense of space in an entirely different way. And looking back, I think one of the things that maybe took me longer to understand about that record is a lot of the drumming especially sounds kind of like nonsensical and pretty wacky. But then once I had the realization that there's intent behind everything, I was just like, oh shit, like he thought about all this. This is how he wanted to sound. And then I started thinking like how hard it would be to create sounds, create drumming that is that off kilter on purpose. It's just kind of mind blowing. And I think he's very well appreciated in the world of heavy music, but I mentioned in there, he's not necessarily like, you're not going to see him on the cover of Drummer's World, although I think you should, because he's not like traditional in a lot of ways. And I guess one of the things I heard a really good funk jazz bass player told me, like a band is only as good as its drummer, and then he also said behind every great band is a great drummer. And so I think if you think of Melvins as being this tremendously impactful band, a lot of it does rest on Dale Crover for sure.
Yeah. And again, this is a record that really, it's only in doing this podcast with you, JJ, that I probably listened to it. I've been listening to Melvins for a while, but never this album, and it was amazing. I think what I picked up on in these early stages of being acquainted to it, and I'm definitely going to listen to it more, is that kind of frenetic energy that you hear within Dale also radiates within so much of the record as well, in terms of like the structure of the songs and the way in which you talk about these disruptive kind of minute-long tracks and stuff like that. It feels like a record that kind of has this sort of frenetic stop-startness all over the place, right?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it really was, I think at its base, it's metal deconstructed in a lot of ways, and it's also like hardcore deconstructed in some ways. It just kind of takes all the traditional understandings of what those things are supposed to sound like and reimagines it into something totally different, while still kind of keeping the original spirit there of antagonism and kind of trying to confront people, and it just approaches that in an entirely different way.
Do you have a favorite track?
I always go back to As It Was, for sure. There's this really awesome Melvins compilation record that came out some years ago, and I Hate God does a cover of that song, and then I retroactively went back and listened to that Melvins track, and it's just one of those riffs that you can't help but get stuck in your head, but then it also includes all those other things you're talking about, the kind of off-kilter weird changes and just overall disorienting nature, and then suddenly in the midst of it is this like maybe even kind of celebratory riff that's very, very catchy and fun in a lot of ways. And so that song has always been the one I go back to.
And have you seen Melvins live?
Yeah, I have seen him a couple times. I was lucky enough to see him when they were doing the two drummer
nice.
thing, when they were joined with Big Business, and again, being a drummer, and Cody Willis just being this phenomenal drummer in Big Business. So seeing him and Dale Crover, just the way they approached having two drummers in a band, and the way they would write compositions, and just essentially use two drummers to make it all feel even that much more woozy and kind of disorienting was just mind-blowing to watch live. And so that's probably always going to be one of the favorite shows that I've seen. And then I've seen them numerous times since then, just as a three-piece, and it's just as awesome. I think one highlight was they were touring with Napalm Death and Melt Banana, and I thought that was such a great just mix of bands that also like weirdly kind of makes sense as far as them just being kind of like off the wall and on a different plane in each of their respective worlds.
Yeah.
So yeah, that was a really good one.
Wow.
Melvins, they're much like Neurosis in that they're just as tight as they ever were, if not that much more tighter. And so I think, to me, it's really inspiring as a musician to just see people who like won't compromise their musicianship in old age, and also like they did party very hard, but I don't know, somehow made it through in a way that they seem relatively healthy now. And so yeah, it kind of blows my mind that they're as old as they are, and they've been doing it for as long as they do, and they still sound so good and so tight. Whereas you have kind of some of the older like 70s bands and stuff like that, when they reunite, it's not so successful. Or when they keep going at that same age or after so long, it doesn't it doesn't sound that good anymore.
On that, let's go to your final record, JJ. If you tell me the name of it, and then again, where you first heard it, how you first heard this one.
Sure. So Through Silver and Blood, and I had been into Through Silver and Blood by Neurosis, I should say. And before that, I had gotten really into ISIS, kind of when I had graduated from high school. I knew about a lot of like sludge and doom, and then when Mastodon's Leviathan came out and I started to discover that band, it really pushed me into just kind of this new understanding of what heavy music could do, that it could also be like very subtle and very layered. And it was also kind of around that time frame that I was like first getting high for the first times and first tried LSD, and so started to hear music in this kind of like different psychedelic way, and really starting to appreciate layering and what that can do in music. And so after Mastodon, I discovered ISIS and got really into it. And I knew that Neurosis was always like a huge influence for ISIS, and I would kind of go back and listen to it, and it just didn't stick for like a couple years for some reason. And then weirdly enough, when I stopped getting high and stopped doing drugs and became sober, that's when Through Silver and Blood really, really hit me. And I remember I was living in Denver, Colorado, which is like 6 hours from my hometown in Wyoming, and I was driving back home in the middle of the night, and I was listening to Through Silver and Blood. And Wyoming is just this very massive, landscape. There's a lot of times kind of the way they laid it out was like 100 miles between each small town, because that's just how they laid out the railroad tracks.
Wow.
And so it's just this place where I think it's very easy to feel your smallness as a human, and really understand how massive nature is, and just understand that, the world is always going to keep going with or without humans, and kind of getting a sense of yeah, like I said, just the true power of nature. And so driving through Wyoming at night, it's easy to just feel like the darkness is kind of just closing in on you, and just feel like very alone. You'll see other like cars on the freeway or semis going by, but it's definitely a very isolating landscape. And so that's kind of, in that environment, and then playing through Silver and Blood for the first time, I remember feeling like something had reached into me and just like grabbed hold, and it was just this very, very intense experience, and this kind of like delving into this weird subconscious space of both myself and the members. And it's just this kind of like very perception altering experience. And again, like I said, this was completely without any drugs or outside influence like that. And so thinking about how impactful that was without any kind of inhibiting substance is still pretty mind-blowing.
Yeah. I mean, are there any particular tracks from that? Again, this is going back a few years, but any particular tracks from that first listen that protrude in memory as being like ones that really connected during that first listen?
Yeah, I think the first song again, with the use of like tribal drumming from multiple members. You have the actual drummer Jason Roeder, who's one of my favorite drummers of all time. He's a great example of that kind of behind the beat, and in the pocket. It's just very, very massive, and it's a type of drumming that I think at first glance, especially to somebody who's like very technically schooled and like deft with different kind of like fills and flashiness or whatever, it might seem like kind of even dumb in a certain way, but when you realize like how unique that feel actually is, it's pretty mind-blowing. And then he's also he's just phenomenal at kind of creating this sense of hypnotism through rhythm. And so when you have the other members pounding on toms along with him, it just is this very primal experience. And so I think it just, again, it's that process of drawing you inside yourself, and also it draws you into the members' subconscious murk that they were dwelling in at the time. And it's just this very surreal, intense experience. And then amidst that kind of repetitive like hypnotism and very deliberate drumming, Neurosis has always been good about like throwing in a couple weird changes and mixing up the timings and stuff like that, to where it just kind of it jolts you out of that daze a little bit, just long enough to kind of like bring you back in. And it's a very impactful experience. And from the first time I actually got it, kind of during that drive, it's probably something I'll never forget.
Yeah, you talk about those changes in the book, and it really made me appreciate them in a new light. It just seems, some of them, in fact, when I really contemplated them, just seem bizarre and fantastic for that reason. Like in the first track, as you say, when it's got that just circling dirge for 4 minutes at the end of the track, and then somehow they decide to just throw in something that suddenly accelerates at the end. Like it defies sense. It feels like it's draining itself of all energy, and then suddenly it's just got a little booster in the tank to do that final little ritual. It's really weird. And I think part of that comes from, if you like read Neurosis interviews and hear a lot of their influences, they came from a like crust punk background, but they also all loved like King Crimson and stuff like that would utilize just odd timings and stuff to kind of create this sense of unease. And so I think Neurosis has always been very smart about understanding how you can shift the feel. And it's like you said, it is jolting, but it's also not it's not like completely out of left field. It always feels like it definitely belongs in the song. One thing you mentioned, I think, is this one produced by Billy Anderson? Is that right?
It was produced by Billy Anderson.
So that his name comes up in the book quite frequently. I mean, was that something that you were aware of prior to writing the book, that there was, Billy's role within forming this music was so prominent?
I think I kind of knew of him as, this pretty like very well respected figure in heavy music, and I knew that he had produced a lot of like very impactful albums. But then when I started to like really line them up as far as like all these records that ended up having this tremendous impact, it became pretty mind-blowing. And still to this day, the production on that album, and then the Weed Eater album, 16 Tons, always stands out to me as being completely massive. And of course Sleep, Dope Smoker as well.
Yeah.
And just this massiveness of sound that I still feel like people are kind of catching up to. And I have no idea, I'm not an audio engineer, for like how he did that, but I think part of it is just that it really shows you the power of trying to work with, or what happens when you work with a producer, or a band works with a producer that really understands where you're coming from and understand what you're going for and what the sound is supposed to be. And I think that's part of why he was, he's such a special audio engineer, is that when Neurosis kind of came in with that record, I'm sure it was mind-blowing for him, but he also knew kind of how it should sound.
Yeah, which is amazing because it's a busy record as well. Like, there's so many elements to put in their place. I mean, another thing you forefront in the book, and I'm glad that you did, because I think it's a very important part of the Neurosis sound, but is the sampling within the music. I mean, you mentioned it's a kind of like a perception-altering experience listening to this album. Yeah. To what extent do you think the sampling plays into that aspect of it?
I think, very extensively. When you hear kind of like going back and reading about the process of recording that record, there's like all the samples and layers of sound that you hear, but then there's also, from what I understand, like multiple layers of sound that are what the members of Neurosis call more like something that you feel.
Yeah.
And so they describe it as something that like is supposed to, like, your brain might recognize it on a subconscious level, but it's not something that you really consciously think about. And so I think, the sampling does a lot of that work to just create this weird pull somewhere deep in your brain that I think a lot of art tries to access, but like it's very rare that something actually does access that. I think of the way I feel listening to Neurosis records is similar to the way I feel watching like a David Lynch film. Of just, it seems very strange and you're very captivated, and then at some point it just reaches inside and pinches this kind of like ancient fear and just something very, very old in your brain. And it's kind of funny that samples would be a way to do that, since it's a form of technology. It's that weird kind of postmodern thing of like trying to access primitive parts of the self, with technology essentially.
And you've alluded to this there, I think, but I mean, when Neurosis appear in interviews, it's clear that enjoyment is too reduced a term to really describe how they're feeling about this music, and doesn't hit the nail on the head at all. Like I did an interview with Scott about, I don't know, 4-6 years ago, where he talked about playing a Neurosis song solo and said, I'd never do that again. Like, it was too much. And you talk about in the book them, playing those through Silver and Blood shows, and it being like an incredibly intense experience and like a bloodletting. And, I think that's reflected in the listening as well. I mean, it's not enjoyment per se. It's so much more complicated than that. What is, this is maybe a nebulous question, but what is it for you that compels you into this music? And I think probably this has pertinence for most other music you talk about in the book. But what is it that draws you into Neurosis? If it's not enjoying it specifically, where is the compulsion to listen to Neurosis for you?
I think it's something about it feeling very, very truthful. It just seems like this very, very pure and accurate, capturing of what it's like to be human and have a human mind. And I know, especially for them, at the time they were recording that record, they were kind of there was a lot of addiction and stuff happening with the band. And they're from Oakland, California, which is kind of a gnarly city that when I've gone to Oakland, I've always been kind of, and I guess it's the same with Los Angeles, I feel like the divide between the rich and the poor is just so stark, and you'll kind of like, you'll go from an impoverished neighborhood to suddenly a couple blocks later you're seeing mansions, and it's just this very weird, surreal experience. And so, yeah, I think it's just something about that recognition and that honesty that just feels very real as like what the world is like and what it's like to exist in the world. And yeah, I think that's something that I always look for in art, is just a accurate depiction of what it's like to, you know, exist in the society and in your own mind. And I think that album recreates that so well. And like I said, there's that kind of that element of fear that album creates comes across from that, because I think there's definitely parts of our minds that are not, you know, like to me, I think maybe the purest like exploration of the subconscious was probably on LSD, and it's just not I mean, again, maybe there's some humor and stuff in there, but it's also just like there's these terrifying elements of the human spirit that you can't really deny. And I think, you know, a lot of this music is just this very honest capturing of that.
JJ, that sounds like a wonderful place to wrap things up. Thank you so much for coming on and talking about your book and your 3 important records and all else besides. This has been great.
Yeah, thanks so much, Jack. I really enjoyed it, and it's great to connect with somebody who, you know, engages with heavy music on kind of an intellectual level and really strives to understand it. And so I really appreciate what you're doing with your podcast.
Thank you. If people want to check out your book, which they definitely should, where's the best place for them to go to do it?
In the US, bookshop.org is a great place to pick it up, because the proceeds end up, from what I understand, the organization is like you know, donating certain portions of proceeds back to indie bookstores, which is obviously very important right now. So bookshop.org is good, but I would also say just however you can get a hold of it is fine. I'm not exactly sure what the availability is internationally.
Nice. Well, thank you again, JJ, and to everyone listening. I'll see you next time. Goodbye.
Thanks so much, Jack.